More than 30 people lost their lives on a Colorado hillside in 1917, an event that forced the nation to confront the human cost of industrial power. This is the story of the Ludlow Massacre, the coal strike that shook America, a conflict born of harsh working conditions, company control of daily life, and a desperate fight for dignity by miners and their families. In the next few minutes, you will learn how ordinary people organized tent communities, how tensions escalated between striking workers, company security, and state forces, and why this confrontation captured headlines from coast to coast. We will listen to the voices of those who lived through it, examine the political and economic forces at play, and trace how the aftermath reshaped labor law, public opinion, and the balance between capital and community. This is not a tale of spectacle, but of cause, consequence, and the hard choices that changed a nation. If you find this kind of history meaningful, please consider subscribing for more clear, careful accounts of moments that shaped America. Hook, a tent city on the Colorado Plains, and a warning shot for a nation. Long-standing grievances over wages, working hours, and the control exerted by coal companies set the scene for a confrontation that would reach across the nation. Miners labored under hazardous conditions and lived in company-owned housing and company stores, where pay was often issued in scrip that could be spent only at the company store. Families from a wide range of immigrant communities, Greek, Italian, Slavic, Mexican, and others, shared language barriers and common hardships, and many turned to the United Mine Workers to press for basic rights and safety. When miners were evicted or forced out of company towns for organizing, they built a tent colony on the open Colorado Plains as both shelter and a visible claim to dignity. It was a makeshift community, with mothers, fathers, and children living in canvas structures, and with churches, schools, and mutual aid networks forming quickly to meet everyday needs. The colony became a symbol of resistance. It also exposed the human stakes in a country that was wrestling with rapid industrial growth and stark inequality. Tensions mounted as mine owners employed private detectives and guards to break the strike, and as state forces were drawn into the dispute. Armed confrontations between company-backed forces and striking miners escalated into a crisis that attracted widespread press coverage and public concern. The images and reports radiating from the plains served as a warning shot for the nation. The industrial model that relied on company control and the suppression of organized labor could explode into open violence and bring national scrutiny. The consequences were profound and long-lasting. Public outrage and congressional attention forced a re-examination of labor practices and corporate responsibility, and the incident altered the reputations of powerful industrial families who had been seen as untouchable. In the years that followed, corporate managers, reformers, and labor leaders were all compelled to rethink workplace relations, safety standards, and the rights of workers to organize. The tent city on the Colorado Plains did more than shelter displaced families for a season. It reframed the national conversation about power, justice, and the costs of industrial progress. If you found this account useful, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched historical narratives. Why a coal strike became a turning point in American labor history. During the early 20th century, the coalfields of Colorado were a microcosm of the larger industrial tensions reshaping the nation. Vast corporate power, immigrant labor, and a struggle over basic human dignity. Mining companies controlled housing, pay, and daily life through company towns and scrip systems that paid workers in company-issued vouchers rather than legal tender. Dangerous working conditions, low wages, and long hours made union organization an appealing and, to many miners, essential option. When members of the United Mine Workers of America organized for recognition and better conditions, the response from companies and hired security forces hardened into a confrontation that would draw national attention. Workers and their families who left company towns to maintain the strike set up tent colonies to survive. These colonies were not mere symbols. They were a practical and visible assertion of communal resilience and mutual aid. Food, childcare, and schooling were improvised. Daily life continued under tents and makeshift shelters. The human stakes were immediate and stark. Men risked their livelihoods. Women managed households under insecure conditions. Children were caught between the need to protect family and the larger fight for a fair wage. Public sympathy grew not simply because of headlines, but because ordinary Americans could see that entire families were being pushed to the margins. The involvement of private detective agencies and the state militia turned labor unrest into a national crisis of public order and corporate accountability. Baldwin Felt's detectives were among the private agents employed to evict striking miners from company housing, and the Colorado National Guard was called in amid escalating tensions. The resulting clash at a tent colony, widely reported in newspapers across the country, produced tragic consequences and a level of public anguish that transcended regional boundaries. The loss of life that followed, affecting men, women, and children, was recounted in detail by reporters and became a catalyst for broader public debate about how corporations and government handled labor disputes. The broader historical consequences were profound. The events forced a national conversation about corporate practices, the use of private armed guards, and the duty of state authorities to protect all citizens. Congressional hearings and widespread press coverage put elites on the defensive and altered public perceptions of industrialists who had previously been viewed primarily as engines of economic growth. In the longer term, the confrontation weakened the position of intransigent company control in the coalfields, strengthened the moral authority of organized labor, and encouraged some industrialists to experiment with reforms aimed at reducing conflict, including limited welfare programs and improved public relations. It also fed into a growing body of political and legal thought that would, over decades, support expanded labor protections and federal oversight. Seen clearly, the strike was not only about coal or pay. It was about the right of workers and their families to live with security and dignity in an industrial age. The struggle illuminated the costs of concentrated corporate authority when left unchecked, and it reshaped how Americans thought about labor, citizenship, and responsibility. For those interested in more accounts of how these struggles changed industrial America, consider subscribing for further narration and context. The Coal Kingdom, company towns, pay, debt, and control. During the 19th century, the coalfields of the American West were transformed into tightly controlled company kingdoms where the mine was more than a workplace. It was the center of economic, social, and political life. Large firms, most notably the Colorado Fuel and Iron Company, exercised influence that reached into every domestic space. Men and women who worked in the mines were often recent immigrants from southern and eastern Europe and from Mexico, drawn by the promise of steady employment. Instead, they encountered piecework pay tied to tonnage, long shifts under hazardous conditions, and wages that left little room for savings. Pay systems reinforced dependence. Wages were commonly calculated on a piece rate basis, paid for coal by the ton rather than for time worked, and miners frequently found discrepancies in the weighing of their product. Companies controlled the scales and the bookkeeping. Paychecks were often supplemented or replaced by company scrip, tokens or vouchers only redeemable at the company store. Prices at those stores ran higher than in free markets, and company agents could deduct rent, medical fees, and other charges directly from earnings. The result was a cycle of advance, purchase, and debt that tethered workers to their employers. Housing and daily life were shaped to the same end. Companies owned the houses, the streets, the schools, and in many cases the churches. Employment decisions carried immediate consequences for entire families because eviction from company housing was a real and frequent tool used to discipline labor. Private guards, company police, and sometimes state forces enforced company rules and protected company property. Union organizers who tried to challenge the system were met with intimidation, blacklisting, and replacement by strikebreakers, which made the choice to organize both economically risky and personally perilous. These structures of control produced clear causes for conflict. When workers attempted to assert bargaining rights through the United Mine Workers and other organizations, they confronted not just a single dispute over wages but an entire economy designed to keep them dependent. Evictions forced families into makeshift tent camps, creating visible symbols of hardship that drew public attention and sympathy beyond the coalfields. The exposure of corporate practices and the involvement of national industrial figures helped turn local labor disputes into subjects of national debate and investigation. Long-term consequences included stronger labor organizing efforts, scrutiny of company towns, and gradual reforms in labor law and corporate practice as the human stakes became impossible to ignore. If you found this account useful, please consider subscribing for more calm, documented narratives. The miners, immigrants, families, danger underground, and why they demanded change. During the period when coal fed the nation's railroads and factories, the workforce in the mines was strikingly diverse. Men and women from Italy, Greece, Slovakia, Austria-Hungary, and Mexico worked side by side with English-speaking miners, and families from those communities lived in company-built housing or clustered in makeshift settlements when evicted. Many spoke little English, which compounded the isolation that came from living and working in remote coal camps under the shadow of company control. Housing, groceries, and even wages were often tied to the company store through scrip, and that economic structure left families vulnerable and dependent. Life beneath the earth was unforgiving and unpredictable. Mines were cramped, poorly ventilated, and filled with coal dust and pockets of gas that could ignite or suffocate without warning. Machinery was heavy and maintenance inconsistent, and mining techniques demanded long hours of hard labor in tight quarters. Illness and chronic respiratory conditions were common among miners who spent their lives inhaling coal dust, and safety regulations were sparse or inadequately enforced in many operations. Men returned home exhausted, and women and children absorbed the daily burden of domestic work while worrying about the next shaft collapse or fire. These conditions were the tangible reasons miners organized and demanded change. They sought union recognition, so that grievances over pay and safety could be addressed collectively instead of being ignored by company officials. They pressed for fair wages and the right to spend those wages anywhere, not only at a company store. They insisted on safer working conditions and independent inspectors, and they fought for the dignity of being able to provide stable shelter and schooling for their children. When evictions occurred as punishment for organizing, families moved into tent colonies and continued their resistance from those makeshift communities. The presence of private guards and replacement workers raised tensions further, turning labor disputes into broader confrontations between corporate power and organized labor. The human stakes were clear. This was about survival, family, and a claim to basic rights that many Americans take for granted. Public attention grew as reporters, clergy, and sympathetic politicians visited camps and shared those first-hand accounts. The outcry helped propel labor issues into national debate and contributed to later reforms in labor law and mine safety, while also strengthening the union movement in mining regions. If this account resonates with you, consider subscribing for more careful looks at the forces that shaped our country. The strike begins, union organizing, evictions, and the rise of the tent colonies. In the coalfields around Trinidad, Colorado, decades of systemic economic control and dangerous working conditions set the stage for collective action. Coal companies ran virtually every aspect of miners' lives: housing, stores, pay, and often local law enforcement. Wages were low, the work hazardous, and pay frequently issued in company scrip that could be spent only at company stores. These practices created a brittle economy in which a single strike could mean immediate homelessness and hunger for entire families. Organizers pointed to these structural injustices when urging miners to join a united front. Union organizers from the United Mine Workers and allied activists moved steadily through the camps, speaking in multiple languages, holding meetings, and helping workers articulate concrete demands. Their calls were practical: recognition of the union, fairer wages, safer working conditions, and an end to the scrip system that tied families to the companies. Mary Harris Mother Jones became a visible voice among the miners, helping to mobilize women as well as men. The union also coordinated legal help and relief efforts, trying to build a durable support network that could sustain a prolonged labor action. The companies answered with pressure rather than negotiation. Landlords and company agents began evicting striking miners from company-owned boarding houses and cottages, sometimes deputizing private guards to enforce removals. Families were forced to carry what they could, and whole neighborhoods entered as work stoppages spread. Private detective agencies were brought in to break strikes and control movement, and local officials often sided with company interests. As a result, evacuation from company housing became not a rare occurrence but an expectation for those who stood with the union. Faced with eviction and winter cold, miners and their families built tent communities on open ground outside company boundaries. One of the largest of these, at Ludlow, sheltered about 1,200 people. These tent colonies were more than makeshift shelter. They became organized centers of daily life and resistance. Communal kitchens and cooperative stores supplied meals and goods. Improvised schools and churches provided continuity for children and families. Strike committees managed food distribution, sanitation, and security. Newspapers and mimeographed bulletins circulated information. Women ran relief kitchens, organized medical care, and sustained morale, while men organized patrols and mutual aid. The camps offered a new kind of social order, born of necessity, where collective decision-making replaced the paternalism of company rule. The human stakes were immediate and visible. Eviction stripped families of a basic sense of security and laid bare the dependency created by company towns. The tent colonies, in turn, made that dependency public, presenting images of displaced families living in tents to a national audience. This visibility drew sympathy from labor supporters, reformers, and parts of the press, and it hardened positions on both sides. In practical terms, the camps allowed the strike to continue by concentrating resources and support, but they also concentrated tensions and made the conflict harder to contain. The pattern of organizing, forced eviction, and communal shelter had lasting consequences. It clarified the limits of corporate control, demonstrated the organizational capacities of working-class communities, and helped galvanize broader public engagement with labor reform. If you would like more scripted narrations like this, Consider subscribing for future pieces. Pressure and power, private detectives, the National Guard, and escalating violence. By the spring of 1917, the conflict in the Colorado coalfields had moved far beyond complaints about wages and housing. It had become a contest of organized power, with private detective agencies and state forces drawn into a cycle of pressure and reprisal. Baldwin-Felts detectives were hired by company managers to break the strike, to escort evictions, and to secure rail lines and mine entrances. Their presence was unmistakable, agents armed and uniformed, traveling in company cars that sometimes carried mounted weapons, used their mobility and reputation to intimidate strikers and to dismantle picket lines. These tactics were intended to reassert control quickly, but they also hardened miners' resolve and reduced the possibilities for negotiation. Company-employed guards and private detectives did not operate in isolation. The Colorado National Guard was called into the region to restore order, a phrase that masked a complex reality on the ground. Troops set up positions near tent colonies and mine camps, and the daily routine of patrols and checkpoints created a militarized environment around civilian life. For many families living in makeshift camps, the Guard's presence offered a fragile promise of safety from vigilante actions. For labor organizers, it often felt like an extension of company power. Tensions grew when soldiers and detectives found themselves on the same hilltops and roads as armed mine guards and increasingly desperate strikers. The lines between law enforcement and strike-breaking blurred. Escalation followed predictable patterns. Skirmishes over picket lines, retaliatory raids on company property, and the forced removal of families from company houses multiplied into larger confrontations. Miners, many of whom were recent immigrants with limited legal protections, improvised defenses, and dug trenches. They mounted armed lookouts and attempted to protect tent colonies where entire families sheltered. Communication through sympathetic newspapers and union networks spread stories of evictions and beatings, which in turn drew national attention and inflamed public sentiment. The involvement of national institutions made local grievances a matter of federal concern, and politicians were forced to respond. The human stakes were stark. Men worried about bread and work, and women and children lived daily with the hazard of conflict at their doorstep. When the most intense clashes occurred around the Ludlow colony, the immediate consequence was not only the physical destruction of tents but the shattering of lives and livelihoods that had little margin for recovery. Beyond the immediate losses, the events triggered inquiries, public outrage, and a re-evaluation of private security's role in labor disputes. Federal intervention followed to stabilize the region, and the episode left a lasting imprint on labor policy debates, corporate reputation, and the way the nation viewed industrial conflict. Lessons from that period shaped later labor relations. Employers reconsidered the open use of armed agents in industrial disputes, while labor organizations gained wider public sympathy and political leverage. Investigations and press coverage forced wealthy industrialists into the spotlight and prompted calls for reform of company towns and for legal protections for workers. In short, the interplay of private detectives, state troops, and everyday people not only escalated a local strike into national crisis but also contributed to a broader shift in how America addressed industrial unrest. If you found this account useful, consider subscribing for more calm, factual narratives about pivotal moments in labor history. Ludlow: How a Single Day Spiraled into Catastrophe, non-graphic. Miners at Ludlow had established a tent colony after being evicted from company housing, and that makeshift community became the focal point of an escalating conflict over wages, working conditions, and basic human dignity. Months of mounting tension had filled the air: strikes, patrols by hired guards and the Colorado National Guard, intermittent clashes and arrests, and a deepening distrust between the striking miners, organized under the United Mine Workers, and the coal operators, led in large part by Colorado Fuel and Iron, which brought national attention because of its ties to a prominent industrial family. The tents were not merely shelters. They held families, meals, and the last possessions of men who had decided they could not return to the mines under the same terms. On the day everything broke, a localized confrontation turned into something far worse. A dispute along the access road and a reported exchange of fire drew armed forces toward the tent colony. Skirmishes lasted for hours. Shots echoed across the hills, and the colony, filled with non-combatants as well as picketers, found itself caught in a widening sweep of violence. Tents and belongings were consumed in the turmoil, and people fled for cover or tried to reach relatives and neighbors. The immediate chaos was compounded by poor communications, confusion about maneuvers on both sides, and the presence of families who had nowhere else to go. The human stakes were enormous and painfully obvious. Miners had left paid work to defend their bargaining demands, and their families bore the brunt: mothers with infants, elders, and children who had been uprooted and were suddenly exposed to danger and loss. Those who survived that day still faced homelessness, legal peril, and the emotional toll of seeing neighbors and friends injured or missing. Journalists who arrived thereafter reported scenes of devastated communities and anguished accounts from those who had been there. The images and stories that reached cities across the country transformed a regional labor dispute into a national moral crisis. Public outrage arose not only because of the immediate violence but because the incident made visible the broader conditions that had produced it: company towns, precarious livelihoods, and the thin line between industrial order and armed conflict. In the aftermath, political and legal consequences followed. Congressional and public inquiries scrutinized the actions of private guards, the National Guard, and company officials, and investment in reforms and oversight of labor conditions increased. The event forced industrialists, even those with national reputations, to reckon with how labor policy, corporate control over housing and food, and forceful suppression of strikes could destabilize whole communities. Long term, the confrontation contributed to shifts in public sentiment that would support stronger labor protections and more scrutiny of company-run towns and private policing. The memory of that single day remained a cautionary tale for labor relations. It showed how unresolved grievances, when met with armed response instead of negotiation, can spiral into catastrophe. For more historical narratives presented in this calm, documentary style, consider subscribing. The Aftermath, Public Outrage, Investigations, and the Wider 10 Days War. News of the attack at Ludlow spread rapidly, carried by newspapers, telegraph wires, and the growing network of labor organizations. Public reaction was swift and intense. Editors who had been indifferent to mining disputes now ran front-page stories, and labor leaders framed the event as evidence of the dangerous mix of private security forces, militia authority, and unregulated corporate power. Voices from urban centers and small towns alike demanded answers, and the human stakes were made plain in testimony about families displaced, communities shattered, and the fragile line between order and violence betrayed. State and federal inquiries followed as a direct result of that public pressure. Officials convened hearings that collected testimony from striking miners, company managers, militia officers, and independent witnesses. Investigators examined the role of company-employed guards as well as the actions of state militia units, and they exposed the deep entanglement of corporate influence with local law enforcement. Prominent industrialists who owned the mines faced intense scrutiny, and one leading employer responded by commissioning an internal review and initiating a program of public relations and workplace reforms aimed at rebuilding trust. Meanwhile, the federal government moved to assert control where local authority had faltered, sending troops to stabilize the region and to supervise the disarmament of combatants. The unrest did not end with the initial confrontation. Across southern Colorado, clashes erupted in a wave that lasted about 10 days, with miners and sympathizers engaging in coordinated actions against rail lines, company facilities, and outlying properties associated with the coal interests. Retribution and defense blurred into one another as armed groups on both sides sought to secure territory and supply lines. Military units imposed curfews and guarded key sites, and federal forces then worked to separate combatants and re-establish civil order. The short, sharp cycle of violence that followed demonstrated how quickly local labor disputes could escalate when armed enforcement and corporate policing were present. Longer-term consequences unfolded in both policy and memory. Politically, the event fueled calls for reforms in labor relations, oversight of private security, and accountability for the use of force by public and quasi-public actors. Labor organizers used the episode to win sympathy and to argue for stronger protections for workers. Employers who survived the crisis often pursued welfare-oriented programs intended to reduce future unrest. Culturally, the conflict entered national consciousness as a cautionary tale about industrial modernization, and it continued to shape debates about corporate power and workers' rights for decades. If you found this account useful, please consider subscribing for more carefully researched historical narratives. The Rockefeller Response, PR, Reforms, and What Changed, and What Didn't. When John D. Rockefeller Jr. stepped into the public eye after the violence in the coalfields, he did so under intense national scrutiny and with a clear awareness that traditional corporate silence would no longer suffice. He retained Ivy Ledbetter Lee, a pioneer of modern public relations, who urged a strategy of openness, prompt responses to the press, and personal engagement. Lee's counsel led to a series of interviews, guided tours of company operations, and carefully framed statements that sought to shift the narrative away from blame and toward corporate responsibility. The move marked one of the earliest sustained efforts by a major industrialist to manage mass public opinion through professional PR. At the same time, Rockefeller Jr. pushed for substantive changes inside Colorado Fuel and Iron, the dominant company at the center of the conflict. Management introduced welfare-oriented measures, company-sponsored housing improvements, medical services, educational opportunities for miners' children, and recreational facilities in some mining towns. They also created new personnel offices and welfare departments designed to address complaints and present the company as a caretaker of worker well-being. A centerpiece of the response was an internal employee representation plan, promoted as a means for workers to voice grievances within a company-sanctioned framework rather than through outside unions. Those reforms brought tangible improvements for many families and reshaped daily life in several communities. Cleaner housing, on-site clinics, and organized social programs reduced some immediate hardships and demonstrated that employers could invest in worker welfare. Yet the changes stopped short of fundamental shifts in industrial democracy. Company control remained firmly in managerial hands. The employee representation system was widely perceived by rank-and-file miners and by independent labor organizers as a substitute for genuine collective bargaining, not a replacement for it. The United Mine Workers and other labor advocates continued to insist on independent union recognition, insisting that company-run programs could not resolve deeper questions of bargaining power and workplace justice. The long-term consequences were mixed but enduring. The episode accelerated the professionalization of public relations and set a pattern for corporations to pair image management with selective welfare benefits, a model later called welfare capitalism. It also hardened labor attitudes toward company initiatives that appeared designed to preempt unionization. Public outrage and the PR campaign together helped push labor issues into the national conversation, contributing indirectly to subsequent legal and political changes that expanded workers' rights in later decades. For the communities affected, the legacy was both practical and political: better local services in some places, but continued struggles over recognition, voice, and control. If this account resonates, consider subscribing for more calm, careful examinations of pivotal moments in labor history. Legacy: How Ludlow Reshaped Labor Rights, Policing, and Corporate Power. In 1914, the confrontation at Ludlow forced a national reckoning by turning a local labor dispute into a matter of public conscience. Workers and their families who lived in company towns, dependent on wages and housing provided by a single employer, suddenly had their struggles framed as a national problem. That shift in focus moved labor from the margins into political debate and produced investigative pressure on both state authorities and the federal government. The owner of the dominant company, John D. Rockefeller Jr., and his corporation became focal points for criticism, prompting high-level scrutiny and a flurry of official inquiries that examined corporate practices, use of force, and the responsibilities of private industry toward its workforce. The longer arc of labor rights in the United States was altered by the way Ludlow reshaped public sympathy and political will. Organized labor won moral legitimacy in the eyes of many Americans. Unions such as the United Mine Workers of America used the episode to argue for recognition, collective bargaining, and safer working conditions. That narrative helped create momentum for legal frameworks that would come later to protect the right to organize and to regulate employer conduct. While change was neither immediate nor linear, Ludlow contributed to a broader political climate in which federal labor protections and stronger enforcement mechanisms became thinkable and politically viable. Policing and the use of armed force in labor disputes were also reconfigured. The visibility of state militia, corporate guards, and armed patrols raised questions about the blurring of public authority and private power. Public debate after Ludlow examined whether armed intervention by the state served the public interest or protected corporate prerogatives, and those discussions informed later reforms in how governments responded to industrial unrest. On the corporate side, Ludlow prompted a strategic pivot toward welfare-oriented management and public relations efforts aimed at reducing hostility and undercutting union appeal. John D. Rockefeller Jr.'s turn toward company-sponsored welfare programs and labor stabilization plans became an early example of welfare capitalism, a model that other employers adopted to varying degrees in order to manage labor relations without conceding genuine collective bargaining rights. The incident left a durable imprint on how Americans think about corporate power, workplace safety, and democratic accountability. It became a touchstone in campaigns for safer mines, better housing for industrial workers, and legal protections that would later be reinforced by national labor law. Memory and commemoration kept the issues alive in public discourse, reminding successive generations that rights at work are contested and that corporate practices invite scrutiny when they affect lives and communities. The lessons of Ludlow continue to resonate in contemporary debates over private policing, corporate social responsibility, and the balance between operational control and workers' rights. For more on labor history and how these threads connect to modern policy, consider subscribing to follow this series. The Ludlow Massacre remains a painful lesson about what happens when economic power goes unchecked and ordinary people fight for dignity. In 1914, coal miners and their families, driven from dangerous working conditions, corporate control of company towns, and inadequate pay, organized a strike that eventually confronted private guards and state forces. The resulting attack on a tent colony cost lives, destroyed homes, and sent shockwaves across the nation. Outrage led to investigations, public debate, and changes in how labor disputes were viewed, contributing to later reforms in labor law, safety standards, and the growth of union influence. Above all, Ludlow is a story of human stakes, families seeking safety, a community's resilience in the face of loss, and the hard-earned progress that followed. If this history moved you, please consider subscribing for more calm, carefully researched episodes. Share what resonated in the comments. Your reflections help keep these lessons alive. In coming videos, we will examine how the labor movement evolved after Ludlow and how those struggles continue to shape work, community, and justice today. Remembering this past helps guide choices for a fairer future.